The battle to legalize cannabis in South Africa continues. The case involving Julian Stobbs and Myrtle Clarke, also known as the Dacha
State
couple,
lawyers have accused partners Julian Stobbs and Myrtle Clarke of trying to escape arrest by launching the case challenging the country's laws against marijuana.
Partners Julian Stobbs and Myrtle Clarke, also known as the Dacha couple, brought various overseas experts to strengthen their case to declare current Dacha laws invalid.
After 7 years of preparing, the trial of the plant is on its way. Jules, Stobbs and Myrtle Clarke are the driving force behind the constitutional hearing to beat the cannabis prohibition in South Africa with facts.
This challenge is a big one. It's called the trial of the plant.
This unprecedented hearing with expert witnesses in the Pretoria High Court lasts for a month, and we are halfway through.
Well, we know we've had 10 days in court and we've only been arguing proper for about 7 of them, maybe 6 of them even. 3.5 days has been lost to this bickering backwards and forwards, and it's absolutely plain to see that the state is batting for a draw. I walk into that court every day and it's like Groundhog Day.
Their opposition is not only the state of South Africa, but also from Doctors for Life, a Christian alliance, a group of people who believe that cannabis is as bad or even worse than heroin.
There is no such thing as medical marijuana, and the specialists are now coming all in agreement on this, that there's no future in using the whole plant for medicinal purposes. The whole plant has a few very serious lifelong negative effects.
On their website, they urged for international support to fund their legal battle against the Dacha couple.
To all Christians out there across the length and breadth of South Africa to pull together and to help us oppose the legalization of Dacha in South Africa.
Lord, that'll be the case for Doctors for Life. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Willis.
We've lost precious time. We've already lost a witness. In the background, we're juggling witnesses around to try and slot them in this week.
After 3 days of arguments regarding technical points, the trial finally started.
Come to the right side, my brothers. You actually belong this side because all of you are smokers. Come this side and let's legalize.
Anti-Dacha protesters from KwaZulu-Natal, who are staying in a Christian rehab center, stood outside the court from day one. Their protest posters and transport being paid and arranged by the Gauteng Department of Social Development.
See, they've shipped a few people in, made some banners. The same people made all the banners. Look, it is exactly the same handwriting.
They are irritating because it's plain to see that they are people who've been rounded up and possibly paid to be there. It's very irritating that there can't be any dialogue between the two sides, but then we understand that because the dialogue is happening in the court.
We've been greeted by a whole bunch of protesters outside the building. They're all over the place. Basically what it's saying, the masses have spoken, gamble with my life, cannabis is a gateway drug. You see, they can't even spell cannabis correctly. These are all being supported by the Department of Social Development, who are actually one of the government agencies who are actually suing.
Inside the courthouse, key witness for the case, Professor David Nutt, took to the stand. Nutt is a psychiatrist, neurologist, and world-renowned expert in the comparative harmful effects of drugs. He worked for the UK government, but was fired in 2007 for telling the truth.
My research at that point had shown that our drug laws were not based on science, in that drugs were being controlled inappropriately. I presented that to the government, and their response was, well, we'd rather not know those facts. And eventually they became irritated by my pressures, criticisms. An election was coming up, and they decided they'd have more chance if they sacked me. So I tell the truth. So the Independent Scientific Committee on Drugs that I set up has a website, which I believe is the only truly independent website on drugs in the world. Drugs, scientists polarize. They polarize according to the source of funding and according to their religious and political beliefs. So it's extremely difficult to get right to the core truth about what drugs do and how harmful they may do. And the big problem we have is that when a drug is illegal, collecting data is difficult. So the data we have is usually, in fact, almost always, of poorer quality than the data we have if we're looking at legal drugs such as alcohol and tobacco and caffeine. Our belief, based on these data, and the same is true where there is data in all Western countries, cannabis cannot cause schizophrenia or psychosis. It can mimic psychosis, but it does not cause schizophrenia. Cannabis does not kill in overdose, whereas alcohol does. In the UK, 3 people a week die just of alcohol poisoning. They just drink more than they should and they drop dead. It turns out that the drug with the highest capture rate is tobacco. 40% of all people who start smoking end up becoming dependent and wishing they hadn't. For heroin and crack cocaine, the dependence rates are of the order of about 30%. About 1/3 of people get dependent. For alcohol, it's about 12%. And for cannabis, we now think it's around about 9%. But with cannabis, there's been a very systematic attempt by scientists, in quotes, to prove it's damaging to the brain. And I don't believe it is. I actually can't really say there's any convincing evidence that it damages the brain. What I can tell you is that the one drug which does damage the brain is alcohol.
6. Does cannabis use lead on to other drug use? You talk about it's commonly known as the gateway theory, or reference to cannabis being a gateway drug.
The gateway theory has been an enormously influential theory particularly in the USA, and it's been used repeatedly for decades as a justification of why cannabis should be kept illegal. And essentially it says that if you use cannabis, you are more likely to go on to use harder drugs. There is no evidence that cannabis makes your brain more vulnerable or interested in heroin or cocaine or other stronger drugs. But the most important refutation of the gateway argument is the fact that the gateway is actually the prohibition of these drugs. And one thing is clear, that people who deal drugs want you, as a drug user, to be on something much more dependence-producing, much more addictive than cannabis. And they will very often offer the cannabis user an opportunity to try out a harder drug. So it's by making cannabis illegal that people who use cannabis meet dealers in harder drugs.
Nutt was under cross-examination by the state advocates and Doctors for Life advocate Reg Willis to show that DACA was more harmful than Nutt had proven in his testimony.
What is absurd, with respect, is that you prefer that all of society be put at risk by another drug. In other words, we know what alcohol does, we've discussed what nicotine does, you now want to add cannabis. What I don't understand is how, as a scientist and as a doctor, you can come and motivate for, whether you call it decriminalization, full legalization, deregulation, regulate, whatever terminology you might use. That's what I cannot understand in the face of all the evidence.
Thank you. The court adjourns.
Dependence he doesn't even know what he's saying. He's such a moron.
Wow. Hello, everybody. We just walked outside for a bit of a break from all of that. The mood has got extremely tense because it's basically the first time any of us have ever been in a court watching a cross-examination, and it's quite brutal. Myrtle and I are sitting there thinking, gosh, this guy's going to actually be hammering on at us as well. We think he's quite rude, we think it's very, very aggressive. We don't think he has much respect for the witness, but we've asked our legal team and they say, no, this is completely normal, don't worry about the thing. This is what cross-examination is. It is a way to discredit evidence, discredit people, and we watch with interest, but the sweaty palms are coming back.
The trial of the plant continues until August the 25th.
Your source of cannabis news. Cannabis News Network.